whose sister I know very well because she wrote a wonderful article for China Report based on oral history about the community and various different groups within the community. Lawrence, I've heard a lot about you and your work in Bangalore, and now you are here, and so we'll ask you to present something. And then you are talking about municipal minorities and the immigration of citizenship, which is a major issue. I think many of you should remember, I think Lawrence will perhaps also point out, that the Chinese don't fit into the OBC or any other categories for the minorities, which would give them access to education and job and so forth. And they don't have any representation in the government to claim that, unlike other groups that have been demanding these kinds of facilities. So it will be good to start from Lawrence about the legal aspects, where this community is stuck, and how the government really oversees or overlooks them as if they are not part of India. Lawrence.
Thank you. Thanks, Tansen, for the introduction. It's also good to finally meet you actually after knowing you virtually for many years. It's been a long time since I've actually seen Legend of Fat Mama. I mean, perhaps more than a decade or so. So while I was watching it, I was also, couldn't help but experience a kind of a tinge of sadness, because it's like watching a family video where a large number of the older people have passed away and a large number of the younger people aren't around any longer. So, the girl the Dragon Dance team, the Farmulan team, where a lot of my nieces are there, 6 of them aren't here any longer. They've gone to Canada. And the precocious little girl, the 2-year-old, Mulan herself, who's my brother's daughter, turns 18 this year. So it's quite a remarkable thing to actually watch this video. I have to confess right at the outset that my own work has really very little to do with the Indian Chinese community. I'm a legal academic and a legal scholar, where a lot of my work pertains to questions of legal rights from a human rights perspective. And it's almost shocking and almost surprising in the way that these two worlds of my personal identity and my academic and professional worlds have never really coincided. So I'm kind of grateful in a way for this opportunity to actually think through some of these questions. The author Zadie Smith has this very nice thing where she says that, I'm the kind of person whose name, face, and passport are constantly in a collision course. And I feel that very often about myself. I remember the first time when I was returning after my master's in the UK, when my lily white passport had been kind of finally stamped to my great relief. I was stopped in the Bombay airport at the customs office by the immigration officer, who insisted that I had to follow him and be interrogated for 45 minutes. And the usual questions, naam, kya karte ho, baap ka naam, that entire thing went on for a long time. And finally I asked him, I said, bhai sahab, itna pareshan kyun kar rahe ho? And he said that no, what had happened was that the day before they had arrested 2 Nepalese trying to leave India for the UK on a fake Indian passport. So I looked at him and I said, "Acha, bhai sahab, rehna tha to London mein rehta, wapas kyun aata?" To which he said, "Haan, wo bhi sahi hai," and let me off. It's kind of a perverse logic to the entire thing. But this question, in a way, of the persistence of the question mark around your identity vis-a-vis your national kind of belonging as a realm of affect versus the domain of kind of the legal status that you have remains something that I think is persistent and never really goes. So in the rare occasion when I am asked to provide legal advice on the question from the community, it more or less always pertains to the question of citizenship and to passports. Very recently I got a call from a relative, and this is basically one of their adopted daughters who was studying to be a nurse in Chennai, applied for an Indian passport, but during the verification process she wasn't at home. So when the policeman came to verify and there was no one at home, he asked the neighbors who lives here, and they said a Chinese family. So the report went back with this statement that this is a Chinese who lives over here. And for the last 4 years she's been attempting to get a passport without any success. Because now this has escalated to the level of the ID inquiry, etc. And this kind of suspicious status of someone who speaks Tamil absolutely fluently, has never really left the country, but continues to struggle on the question of passport. Now, you already mentioned the other side of the story, which is the problem that the older generation faces, which is, the possession of a PRC certificate and the constant, kind of visits to the, foreigners' registration office and the police stations to renew their passports. It came to a point when my granduncle, who was in Calcutta, and bedridden at that point of time and unable to walk, was paid a visit by the police. My aunt in frustration said, take him away, it'll be a great relief to the entire family, you take care of him, we won't take care of him. And unfortunately, the police didn't do that, and that was the end of that story. But between these two realms, the impossibility of getting a passport on the one hand, and the impossibility of giving up a passport on the other, the question of the Indian Chinese community and the vexed citizenship and the vexed belonging that they feel seems to be suspended between the two. The question that immediately arises is, why is it that despite so many years, there isn't the possibility of making any kind of claim, whether legal or political, like you would in any other community? And that's really the two issues that I wanted to talk about today. Very briefly, to look at this question of numbers and political imagination. How do we think about the question of minorities? And I'll come to this phrase, minuscule minority, because I take it from a very specific kind of context. When you look at the question of numbers and enumeration, of course, the question of numbers are crucial in any kind of imagination of the domain of the political. But particularly so when you're looking at a country like India, where the question of India's democracy as the largest democracy, a premise that's made in a way on an enumerative claim, and you're also looking at the question of the relationship between India and China, the two largest countries in the world. Again, what you have persistently is this idea of big data in terms of the largeness of the numbers that we're talking about. And the Indian Chinese community, as we've already heard, seems to be stuck in a very strange place where literally we're talking about extremely small numbers. No matter whether it's the historical peak or the current kind of waning of the community in India, the fact of the matter is that we are at the end of the day talking about extremely small numbers trapped within the narrative of extremely large numbers. And what does that actually do? There's a very nice thing that Lenin once said, where he says that politics is where the masses are, not where the thousands are, but where the millions are, and that's where serious politics happens. Now, if one were to take that claim as really, in one sense, alerting us then to the question of what happens then to the sight of small numbers, and why is it that there is an impossibility of a political imagination that emerges not from the large but from the very minuscule. And here, the phrase minuscule minority I invoke from a particularly kind of odious judgment of the Supreme Court. This is a judgment called Suresh Kumar Kaushal, which went into the legality of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which basically criminalizes homosexuality. This was an appeal from the Delhi High Court in a judgment called the Nas Foundation case, which had decriminalized homosexuality in India, and an extremely progressive judgment welcomed by all. In the Suresh Kumar Kaushal judgment, Justice Singhvi, reverting the High Court judgment, described homosexuals in India as being minuscule minorities. And this invocation again of the question of size in relationship to the question of claims, the presumption was that because it is a minuscule minority, it does not have the same level or kind of demand the same kind of level of legal rights or protection that a significant minority would. And here I think the problem of the Indian Chinese community is accentuated by the fact that the language of the majority-minority discourse in the Indian context has been dominated by two things. One, of course, is the question of religion, and the other is the question of caste. And here we're talking about very, again, extremely large numbers. So that when one speaks about a minority question, one is really talking about this in relationship to a larger kind of a subset. So what does it mean to speak then about a minority that doesn't actually fit within the realms of political representation in terms of counting either as a vote bank or as a community with any political kind of significance? Or what does it mean to think about a community that actually falls out of the logic of enumeration? And what are the other things that we will have to then think about if it is not the numbers game that one can make any kind of claims on? Very clearly, what is kind of paradoxical about the Chinese community in India is that despite the tiny kind of size and despite the relatively insignificant numbers, There is a cultural significance, especially in cities like Calcutta, and of course, earlier in other parts of the Northeast, etc., which doesn't quite square up. So in a way, one could say that while they are culturally present, they are politically absent, and this is not just in the case of kind of mainstream imagination. If you look, for example, at the scholarly work done on citizenship in India, and here I have in mind Vijay Gopal's book on citizenship, or Anupama Roy's Mapping Citizenship in India, very significant academic contributions, but you never even find a footnote referring to the Chinese community. So what you have here is a very strange situation in which there is a very large symbolic weight of the two large countries that is actually borne by a very tiny number of people. So it points out in a way to the absolute limitation of playing or making this kind of a numbers game, and what we really need is then a slightly different account where the normative grounding of our politics cannot be based in a way on the real politics of numbers. In other words, we can't subsume the kind of normative politics that one would like to the idea of what counts or what doesn't count. And in that sense, I think, and here, I've just started reading Tansen's new book, and I find it absolutely remarkable. That how does one think, for example, about an appeal to an older logic of cosmopolitanism? How does one think about the idea of hospitality as a certain kind of a virtue ethic that one has to think about, not in relationship to the question of the survival of the Chinese community in India? That, of course, is an important question. But what does it mean to think about the survival of a certain imagination of India? Not so much from the perspective of the guest, but from the perspective of the host. And I'll come to why this is in a way kind of crucial. Because if one had to think about the contemporary, the burning issues of the last year, the Rohingya crisis in Burma, and the absolute inhospitality that was displayed in relation to the Rohingyas, it points out to a certain kind of a larger question of how this relatively tiny history of nation-state forms, and something which Tansen is very, very critical of, have become naturalized to the extent that very old, longer civilizational histories of transactions, of of exchanges, etc., have been suspended or foregone and subsumed under the logic of territorial claims or under the logic of citizenship claims. And I think that it's really important in a way that if one were to think about the generosity of hospitality, not just from the perspective of the guest, but also of the host, there is a way in which, as Derrida reminds us in his work on hospitality, that every house requires a window or a door, because it requires an opening out into the world. And what really, in a way, I am asking for is that when thinking about communities like the Chinese community, how may we think about the relationship between the foreigner and the nation, not in terms of the host-guest metaphor, but really the foreigner as founder. And what is it that the foreigner founds? Bonnie Honig in her work, Democracy and the Foreigner, claims that if democratic cosmopolitanism is seen as a site of invention rather than the site of exhaustion, it really alerts us or demands of us an ethical inventiveness in which one looks at the participation of minuscule minorities as inventors. And this is very evident both in the film as well as in what Tansen has said. So how do we, in other words, insert the minuscule minority into the heart of constitutional and legal and political imagination in India? And for me, this really, in a way, if one had to think about the hierarchy of citizenship that actually exists, there is, of course, the natural inhabitants, and then there are the hyphenated minorities, in the words of Gyan Pandey, where the hyphenated minorities somehow are short of being the ideal citizens. Now, you can think about this in terms of the Indian Muslim or the Indian Chinese, etc. If the cosmopolitan ideal challenges this idea of the hierarchy of citizenships, then perhaps what we really need is an accounting which is not about the numbers game of the population, but in an accounting in a much richer and a much thicker sense of the word, not this kind of a thin idea of numbers. And that, for me, is really, in some ways, if one looks at all the work that's done by various people here, the account provided, the richness of the account, whether in terms of historical approaches or in terms of the film, etc., really gives us the sense of what is it that we're losing. In the film, Rafiq ends with a statement like the trams, the Chinese are going, gone. But what exactly is going, right? What happens when minuscule minorities disappear? At one level, nothing really changes. But of course, at another level, nothing remains the same. Can you, for example, imagine a Calcutta without the imprint in a way of the Chinese community? But this domain of the unsurety of what the cultural richness is it complete without a political acknowledgement? And that really is the question again that Tansen has raised, which is that how does one think about the richness of the lives of the Chinese in India in terms of their contribution or their role as founders? But how can one think about that without an acknowledgement of the extremely scarred and wounded belonging that 62 really, kind of marks? If one had to think, for example, about 62 as in a way kind of creating an affect of a wounded attachment, what are the ways in which one will be able to move ahead without an acknowledgement of this? And this is a very complicated question. The dilemma, for example, of the Dioli internees who are in Canada asking for an acknowledgement from the Indian state as well as the Indian people makes it very complicated for the Indian Chinese community still living here. So even as recently as the Doklam standoff that happened, a number of my relatives in Bangalore were instructing the children, to decry and disavow their Chinese identity in public because of the fear of 62. So what does it mean for us to be able to make this acknowledgement at a time when we're not even living in a way in the relatively benign period of Nehru, right? It's not the state that fears us now as much as the lynch mob. And in a way, it becomes a really serious question about what it means to make any political assertion or any kind of political claim at a time when all communities feel extremely vulnerable, and when you're a minuscule minority, the vulnerability that you face is a lot more acute. And I think the onus then is no longer on the community as much as on everyone else to actually make these assertions. And in that sense, that conversation is something that's just about beginning. If one had to think about the ways in which one would imagine a cosmopolitan ideal, I can think of none which is higher than what Amitav Ghosh writes about in An Antique Land, where he says that Egypt, because he did his field work in Egypt, he said Egypt gave him a sense of belonging. Egypt gave him a sense of being of an entitlement where a country could belong to you even if you did not belong to a country. And I think that in the case of the Indian Chinese community, despite the fact that the Chinese in India have always belonged to India, this feeling and this sentiment of the country not belonging to them is something that's extremely kind of, anachronistic. It doesn't kind of fit in well. And I think if the beginnings that have to be made is really about both a simultaneous kind of an acknowledgement of this idea of the wounded attachment, as well as of imagining a future in which minuscule minorities count as much as any others would be, a starting point. So I'll just end with some of these kind of preliminary thoughts, and happy to take on questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think there will be lots of Q&A on those issues. We are changing the schedule a bit. We'll ask Rita to present next before joining. Rita just has a new book that came out. It won a prize when it was written in Assami, as Master Kanta pointed out, Makum. Now it's available as Chinatown Days, and she has done a lot of research among many of these so-called returnees in Hong Kong and other places. And this story is about those people, and I think she's going to talk about the victims of war, the uprooting of a society. And again, I think one point that Lawrence made is not only the government, it's the lynch mob who actually also destroyed many of the things that belong to the Chinese. If you go to Kalimpong, for example, you see how the earlier places that the Chinese had have been taken over by the locals. So Rita, please.
I don't know from where I should start. I saw the Indian Chinese when I was a college student, and I decided that I would write about these people one day. So in 2006, I went to Makum to to see this Chinatown there. We call it Chinapatti. And then I came to know about the plight of the Indian Chinese. The Indian Chinese who suffered, who became victims of war between two countries. So it became then I tried to know in detail about the happenings. But people were not prepared to tell about the incidents or anything that they have experienced. They were still in fear, especially the older people. They were not ready to answer my questions. Only a few answered. Then luckily I could go to Hong Kong and to China to meet those people living in Hong Kong. I met a few people living in different parts of the world, including Kathmandu. So this book covers 3 parts. The first part covers the beginning of the diaspora, especially in Assam and the hilly districts of West Bengal. So it is related to tea history. British actually smuggled a few Chinese from China who were expert in tea making. They were tea growers, tea makers, and they started tea history, the tea industry in Assam. So then there was normal migration from China to Assam, and already you have discussed about Tansen has discussed about this migration. And then there was another there's a coolie trade going on, and British brought the coolies from different coolie depots of Penang, Macau, and different parts of the world, in Singapore, and from different parts of British Indian coolies. So they married the Indian girls, and it was the beginning of a new society called Assamese Chinese. My novel focuses mostly on the Assamese Chinese, but it also covers some stories about the Chinese living in tea gardens of West Bengal and the Chinatown of Kolkata. So it is very difficult to depict the suffering of the Indian Chinese because words are limited. It is very difficult to express. I tried my best to write about this, the story of the Indian Chinese in my book called Makum. Now it is Chinatown Days. So I want to show you a few things about those people, because it is about actually the divided soul. The people came from China or different parts of coolie depots of Penang or Singapore. They married local girls. So there were 2-3 generations. Their grandmothers were Indians, mothers were Indians, their wives were Indians. But in the last part of the India-China war, actually this Chinese community in Assam and in Darjeeling, Kalimpong, they were Cantonese Chinese, and they become a part of the greater Indian identity. And who were born or who were there in India before 1947, naturally they were Indian citizens. So these people, most of these people did not see China or forgot the Chinese language. They have the names and the titles, their features have changed. Many people could not know. If you see that, we cannot recognize that they are Chinese. So in time of, in the last part of the India-China war, suddenly paramilitary forces and the police all get out Chinatowns, especially in Makum and in different parts of that hilly district of West Bengal and Tangra, they were told that for only 2-3 days they were shifted to a safer place because their security was under threat. They were told to take only the papers and everything they left behind, and they went out empty-handed. In Assam, especially in Makum, the biggest Chinatown in Assam, they were put in a cowshed. Then they were taken to the Dibrugarh jail, and all their their ornaments, money, everything, they were taken away. In the morning, they boarded in a train, in a closed train, and they were sent to the Dehradun internment camp. And many of these people who were arrested from the other side of Brahmaputra and from other tea gardens were put in different jails of Assam. So in the 7-day journey, we have already seen in Rafiq Elias documentary that they were given half-cooked food, and there was no water. They suffered a lot. There were small children, there were pregnant women, there were old people. And India was a democratic state. But we all know, in time of war, all democratic states transform to an authoritarian state. They forget about humanity. They forget about their responsibility to the innocent civilians caught in time of war. And it is about human rights, and it inspired me. I take it as a mission. So I started researching and I started meeting people and I wrote the book. And before that, no one in Assam knew about this thing, that what happened to those people. Suddenly, a community was disappeared. And the people who are still living in Assam, they become silent. They did not want to speak anything. A section of the Chinese changed their identity. They took Indian titles, surnames, so that no one can recognize them as Chinese. So it's a very sad story. So I want to show you a few things so that you can know about this. People already in this lesson, the Fat Mama, we have seen many that what happened to those people and their feelings. Now I want to show you a few things. Like Calcutta Chinese condemns the invaders. They condemn, but panic discernible among Chinese. There were 1,200 stateless in Calcutta. Those people, some people had Indian citizenship, some had PRC passport, some had Kuomintang passport. So most of them were stateless and they were illiterate. They did not know what is happening. They had no idea about India-China war. And when there was when the war was going on, that internal conflict was going on in China. Before that, Nehru had a very good relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. So people felt safe. Then many people came from China who did not want to face this kind of crisis. So then suddenly situation changed, and Nehru became friend of the PLC leadership. So then immediately that situation in the Chinese community also changed, whom to support. They thought that Nehru was with them. So there is no problem to speak against the communist people of China. Then suddenly the situation changed, and those people who supported when that Nehru was a friend of communist China, so many people started taking PRC passport and started openly supporting communist China. But again, when the conflict started, again they were in dilemma what to do. Then they were again against their name, that question mark was put, that when they were a supporter of communist China. So I have tried to depict about this confusion and the helplessness of the Indian Chinese who were not at any fault. Then those people, I want to read a few things from this book. Like, there are many small news came in the newspaper where Chinese national arrested. They were pushed out from what's called in the Darjeeling, that pass, the Nathula Pass. They were sent back to China from Nathula Pass. Many people were sent back, they left behind their families. Then suddenly, at the same time, they were arrested and put in the Delhi internment camps, and most of them were deported to China. But in time of arresting those people, families were divided because their features were changed. The police came and the magistrate came, and whom they thought that this is Chinese, arrested, families were left behind. Mother was separated from children, husband separated from wife. It was a total chaos. Then, after a few months, they were told that Chinese ships are coming, so you can go to China. So many Indians, Indian wives, many Indian Chinese went to China. I want to tell about this lady. Tachan has said that lady, Leah Linchi. Okay, Linchi was 6 years old only, and her mother was a Mizo and father was Chinese. She was at her grandmother's place when they were arrested and they were deported to China. And there was papers where they signed that they were willing to go to China. Now tell me, is any parent will agree to go to China leaving behind their 6 years old girl? But they wrote to Indian government that we are willing to go. There must be some forces. They may be compelled. There are lots of paper I have collected where I have found this kind of, the thumb impression that they were willing to go to China. And records that it is there. But I don't know, I have a case. I know her. And finally, after 50 years or 53 years, she met her parents in China. They speak in fluent Assamese. There's a lady called Pramila Gogoi. She was a headmistress of an Assamese school. She went to China with her husband and children. She taught Assamese to some people there, who can work as newsreader in the Chinese radio. She died in China. I met her children. One of her son, his family was left behind somewhere in Golaghat, and he became very silent. And when they came to Hong Kong, the owner of the company asked him what happened to him. He told that my wife and children are now in India. He told him, call them, I will give you all the support. Then he wrote to them, now you can come to Hong Kong. Come. But they always, their children were grown up. They told her mother, we are not willing to go to China or Hong Kong. You cannot go. So finally, she was forced to live in Assam, and her husband committed suicide. So there were many incidents. I want to say about this belonging. It's a complex belonging. I met one person in China who told me that India is our motherland and China is our fatherland, he said. So if both the countries grow or develop, I'll be very happy. Someone said that in India, they told me, you are Chinese, you go. I went to China. In China, they say, you don't look Chinese. Where from you come to China? You are not Chinese. Now he said, now what can we do? And we have to hang ourselves and die. We are nobody's child. So in my novel, I have tried to capture that part. What they face in India, what is their background, and how they were deported to China, and what they faced in China too. It is a time of cultural revolution. They went from a capitalist country. So we can understand that what kind of situation they could have faced. So, do I have time?
2 more minutes.
2 minutes, okay. I want to show you a few things like how they remember India in China, in Hong Kong. It is always they celebrate the India Day, that dances. They are still living somewhere. They are still in 1960s. They listen to old songs, of Hindi songs especially. See, these are the 2 women. They died in China. They are wearing mekhala chadar. They are Assamese ladies. They are not Chinese. They were Indian citizens. But this is, you see them wearing mekhala chadar in China. One of them is Pramila Gogoi. And they prayed to Indian government. Many of them, let us live here. Let me transfer from this jail to that jail, so that I can be near to my family who are living, who are outside jail. These are the, you see, these are the people. All Indian Chinese. So it is about the belonging. There are hundreds of things I have, that is, hundreds of stories. Every Indian Chinese has a story of suffering and pain. Every Indian Chinese is carrying one epic inside him or her. I try to capture it so that people can know what happened to them, so that the world can know that what is the actual position of the Indian Chinese now. In India, they are still in fear. The new generation, they don't care. But when there is a crisis, they feel that, okay, people are looking at me, people are asking weird questions. They look at us with doubt. My mission is to remove this fear from their mind, and they should feel equal. They should feel free. They should get equal opportunity. They don't have to prove their identity or their loyalty to this country. The people who were deported as unwanted, they are carrying the tag that they were sent back from one country as unwanted because their integrity was doubtful. They are carrying that pain. My mission is to remove that pain. And I want that they call India as their Janam Jaga. They always, the Chinese people, they want to come back to their birthplace once before they die. Many people I met in China who died without seeing their birthplace, their Janam Jaga. So there should be that kind of, we can open this. They are now started coming slowly, that because of the support of many people, that the committed people who are thinking about the Indian Chinese. So I want to be a part of that mission. I've written this book from the victim perspective, and I want that they should live. If there is any war between India and China, this should not be repeated. And to protect those people, there should be awareness worldwide. Media people should know. The people of that who are working for the human rights, they should know. The readers, they should know. So that in time of war, states if fight, we don't fight, we are small people. States fight and we suffer. And this suffering continues. So I want that it should not be repeated again. For that we have to work, to have to carry this message to the world audience, that in time of war, how people suffers, and for generations after generation they carry the sufferings. That's all for today. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak out now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. That was a coffee table book that she has also produced. I think that's also worth flipping through. Our speaker before the Q&A session, the last one, is Joyini Banerjee. She is at the Jindal and now has been working on a manuscript on the Chinese community. Her dissertation was on comparing Anglo-Indian and Chinese Indians. Her talk is about migration and shifting notions of home.
For giving that very broad overview. I think you made a lot of our work a lot easier. And I think my talk follows on quite well from Lawrence's presentation on the idea of minuscule minorities, followed by Rita's work. I've just started reading Chinatown Days, and I have to say that it's a very emotional insight into the plight of the community during the 62 war. The idea that I want to focus on is the idea of home. And I think we've been talking about complex belongings a lot today, though the idea of home is also integrally related to the idea of belonging. A discussion on migration inevitably throws up issues and ideas of home, and much contemporary rhetoric on migrants all over the world these days raises cries of "go back home," usually referring to an assumed country of origin somehow linked to one's ethnicity and color of skin. But where is home? This, of course, is a complex question for migrant communities, and even more complex for the Chinese Indian community. Introducing his book on China, India, China and the World, Tan Sen spoke about the need to think beyond the framework of the nation in thinking about and understanding issues of connection between people and places. And while there is no denying that the nation state and the violence of wars leave deep scars in the life of migrants, and indeed unsettle all ideas of home, there is also a need to understand and analyze such an emotive concept as home at scales that are beyond the nation. So in today's presentation, I'll just focus on three snippets that have come up in my research in various contexts, and which throws up different questions and different ways in thinking about the idea of home. The first comes from archival research, and along with Tansen, when we were looking through the West Bengal State Archives, which, as Tansen mentioned, includes a lot of information, particularly police information, that had been collected about the Chinese community in India. And a few instances sort of caught my attention, and it seemed, and a fact that I didn't know when I started my research on the community, is that some of the early Chinese migrants to India came as part of a circus. So they were circus performers, and they moved to India. And of course, as Tansen mentioned again at the beginning of his talk today, that free movement for the Chinese within India was a security concern. So the police had to keep detailed records of where the Chinese were moving. And the archives have thrown up fascinating insights into these things, because you can imagine that as a circus performer, people would move from place to place, but they would also have to report to the police each time they moved to a new place. So this fascinating insight I came into. This person, he had followed his father at the age of 8, and he had traveled from Lahore to Bombay to Calcutta, practically all over India. But it really posed, a problem to the police. Now, while archival details do not note the frustration or the perplexity of the police to establish a home or a permanent base, even within the Indian subcontinent, one can imagine the problem that such a mobile population posed for the authorities. So the first issue that I would like to pose in respect to the idea of home is that historicizing the presence of the Chinese in the Indian subcontinent requires tracing the connections that stretched beyond the current nation-state boundaries. And Alice Lin, who's doing her PhD at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, has worked on the Chinese in Pakistan. So while we are talking about the Chinese community in India today, I think there is also a need to think about their presence in the wider Indian subcontinent as a whole. The second story, or the second snippet, comes from my field notes. And as Tansen mentioned, my research focused on trying and understanding the connections between the Anglo-Indians and the Chinese. My research focused on Calcutta specifically, and the two communities in Calcutta and as they migrated out of Calcutta. And I was trying to understand how these two communities related to each other as minorities. Lawrence raised the issue of the idea of minuscule minorities, and I think communities such as the Anglo-Indians and the Chinese pose very interesting questions. So, going over my field notes, I came across one anecdote where a Chinese person had told me that in talking about the connections with the Anglo-Indians, and he had said that one day he was standing in queue to buy a cinema ticket, and a fight broke out. And this was before 1947. An Anglo-Indian had come to his rescue. And he said that this would not have happened after 1947. So again, when we think about issues of home, we need to think about also how communities draw on these sense of minority. We spoke a lot about community structures providing a sense of home in Calcutta. And as we saw, these were established through schools, temples, regional or surname associations. Some Chinese here, you see the one was Henry Au, who owned a famous restaurant in Calcutta, but who also owned a racehorse. That was the connection again with the Anglo-Indians there. And the other one is a photograph of a young Chinese lady in a sari. We've been talking about the difficulties of thinking about the issue of home through the idea of the nation. For the Chinese, the notion of belonging to the nation is fraught with the tensions of the 1962 war, as we have seen. Like the Anglo-Indian community, this tension is often expressed in racial and embodied terms. And one of my interviewers, Michael Lim, said that China gave me my color, I quote, but India is my homeland. For the initial settlers in Calcutta, the idea of China as home was retained through everyday practices of culture. And here I think the generational difference is important to understand. So another interviewee, for example, Mi Ling, said that, talking about her parents, they all, and I quote here again, they all wanted to go back. I think us, those who were born in the 40s and 50s, were the first generation born there in Calcutta. The first generation to actually break out of the mold, because I know that my parents never had any Cantonese friends. This lady was a Hakka Chinese. They didn't even want to learn Hindi. They were very afraid. We had to be brought up as Chinese and kind of drilled into us that thrice a year we have to go to the cemetery. It's a clan bonding thing. My parents wanted to go back home. All they wanted to go back. But because the Chinese community concentrated in Calcutta, there were also frequent connections between the idea of the nation and this idea of the city as home, something that I have explored in more detail in my research. So there is again, for example, this idea of Calcutta as home. But questions of home also raise questions of unhomeliness. And we've been talking a lot about the 62 war. The first photo on the left side was taken at the Chinese consulate around 1955, and the other one is from a school, Xinhua, which was shut down after the 62 war. So there are memories of these places again, which create a sense of home in the memory, which is there. It forms a part of the idea of home, that is Calcutta, to the community, but it also points out to the unhomeliness of that sense of belonging. I'll move on to the third snippet, and which is about the idea of home now that the community has dwindled in Calcutta. One of my interests was to see the connections between different cities and different urban spaces. And we got to know that most Calcutta Chinese have migrated to Toronto. In fact, there are more Calcutta Chinese in Toronto than in Calcutta at the moment. And this poem here sort of looks at those memories of Calcutta which form a sense of home. And I'll move on to this story of from one of Kwai Yun Lee's book. The Canadian edition is called The Palm Leaf Fan and Other Stories. And the Indian edition, which was published, was called The Last Dragon Dance. Now, Jade, one of the short stories in the Palm Leaf Fan edition, follows the life of the central character Jade across her different homes in Calcutta and Toronto, and charts an interesting route that many Calcutta Chinese women have taken, negotiating the promise of a better life in Toronto and arranged marriage. The story interestingly flits between the crowded setting of 14 by 1 Chatawala Gully, very precise location in Calcutta, where Jade lives with her extended family, 5 Trafford Road, Markham, Toronto, where Jade and her husband share a 3-bedroom house with her parents-in-law and 4 brothers-in-law. Markham is an area in Toronto where again many Indian Chinese have resettled. And 17 Pioneer Road, Scarborough, a 1-room basement apartment where a pregnant Jade moves in with her husband and 2 children. It is an interesting story because it reveals several aspects of what Aftab Ra has called the homing desire of a migrant community, and here for the Calcutta Chinese diaspora in Toronto. It offers readers a glimpse into the patriarchal nature of the Chinese, particularly the Hakka Chinese community, and the home life of Hakka women in central Calcutta. It also highlights issues around sharing home space and owning a home in Toronto. So when we talk about home, while home is an emotional concept, it's also a material concept. And this story talks a bit about this material context of home. But what does home mean to the Chinese, the Calcutta Chinese who have moved to Toronto? And when I interviewed Brenda Chen, who lives in Toronto, she says, and I quote, "Now it is Toronto, but there's always the sense that I was raised in Calcutta. The more I live in Toronto, it becomes home. But because you are in Toronto, they ask, where are you from originally? It's always like, oh yes, but, and then you say you are from Calcutta. The funny thing is you never say India, always Calcutta, because you always want to distinguish in your mind that you're not from Bombay or Delhi. And the point is, if the question comes from someone with an Indian background and you say you are from India, they look almost shocked. So you always have to qualify and say that you are from Calcutta. So again, this I think brings back Lawrence's points about these connections between how you look, what is your paper, what is your citizenship, what is your sense of belonging, so on. I think I'll leave it there, and we can move on to the question and answer.
We'll do about 20 minutes of Q&A if you have, and then move on to the final three papers. I think a lot of issues have been raised, and you can ask any of the three participants about what they have presented and what you need to know that was not presented. So, Rita, you want to come? Is there a mic there? It would be nice if you introduce yourself. Hello. Yes, can you get that ready?
My name is James Yap. Ye Sung Fa is my actual name. Born and brought up in Delhi, that too in Connaught Place. Now, all these incidents that had happened during the 62 war, I was maybe 11, 12 years old then. So 1949 born. My father came from China in 1946, and he was handed a stateless passport, yellowish colored passport. So he was not given, till very in his final years, that he was given an Indian passport. So we automatically became an Indian citizen. My question is, all these that has happened, all these incidents that have happened, why Delhi is not being referred to? I feel a bit let down.
We always talk about Delhi.
Yeah, they always talk about Calcutta. There are Chinese in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Chennai. See, why don't they refer to the entire community?
Yes, one by one. Any questions? I think Severin is one. She works on she is herself an Indian Chinese born in Delhi.
I'm a Pakka in Delhi.
She is also a Pakka.
James, I think that's an interesting point that you raised, and that's precisely a question that I explored in my research. My research was on Calcutta. It wasn't generally on the Chinese community. And one of the things that came through, and a point that I raised in the presentation today, is that indeed I think these local belongings are quite important. So while we may talk about the Chinese Indian community as a whole, it might make more sense to talk about the Calcutta Chinese identity or a Delhi Chinese identity. And I hope Severin's work will throw up an interesting contrast to, many of us who are working on Calcutta. I agree that, there is a disbalance there, but it's certainly an important point to consider. So hopefully Severin will throw more light on that.
I've already worked on the Delhi Chinese in my intel research, and I also had this issue because I'm a Delhi Chinese myself. So that is why I wanted to specifically focus on the nuanced differences that there is within the community. Like Tansen also mentioned, it's not just Chinese as an umbrella rubric that we look at. Well, there's so many nuanced differences within the community. Forget Delhi, Calcutta, Hakka, not Hakka, language differences. So I do see that, and I did try and bring out that to the foreground, during writing, while I was writing my FF. So I hope I can give you a copy of that, and maybe it'll make you happier.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. Ambassador?
Ashok Kant. I just wanted a couple of factual clarifications. One from Lawrence. How does the system of citizenship through naturalization work for people of Chinese ancestry? And from Rita, you referred to the desired returnees, those who had gone back to China or deported to China, to come and see their home place. What's the problem there? In terms of getting visa or permissions, is there some issue there?
Lawrence?
So as far as the Indian Citizenship Act is concerned, it's very clear. And in that sense, anyone who's born in India, you are automatically entitled. So with the second generation, there isn't much of a problem. Those who apply for citizenship, of course, get it. The problem is really in terms of the class of the older Chinese who actually hold their PRCs and passports. And the conversion of that has been next to impossible. A number of people have actually attempted to. It's not so much about the legal right as much as the bureaucratic entanglement that you actually get stuck in. And as I indicated in the very first story, where even with the younger generation, you could still very much kind of get caught in a Kafkaesque, endless vortex of having to prove that you're not Chinese in the sense of nationality. And the category, of Chineseness as ethnicity really kind of constantly coming in the way of your being able to obtain Indian citizenship cuts across all the generations. Even in my own experience of applying for a passport despite having all the documents, etc., this constant idea of the befuddlement that you encounter of trying to explain that you're not from the Northeast and that you're not of Chinese, of Chinese descent, but very much Indian. This question of belonging is a very strange one because in a way, kind of for me, it's a very odd experience where very often I forget that I look slightly different until I'm reminded of that because I feel entirely, Indian. And when I went to China for the first time, I've never felt as out of home as I did in China because I forgot that I looked the same. I expected everyone to treat me like a foreigner, and no one did, and it was completely uncanny, which is appropriate given that it is, unhomely. So.
Rita?
It is not about not getting visa and all. Actually, the fear. People living in Hong Kong, especially in Hong Kong and China, they have the fear. They did not come to India. They have the wish, but they could not come. Some of them came only. When they came, they had to face many questions in the airport, and the gifts they brought with them, taken away by the security people. They were asked many questions, and when they go to, suppose in Assam, local police, they come and they question them. Actually, the fear was there mainly. I want to remove the fear. After the book was published, there was awareness. I met those people in Hong Kong. They have started coming to Assam because they think that Rita is there. She will save us if we are in any trouble. So when they come in a group, and they meet me. And media people also, they are giving support. And now things are much better than, especially my experience in Assam. So still, fear is there, still.
The fear is also among the Chinese in China. That what will the Chinese say in consulate, for example? So they are afraid of that because they are seen differently.
Yeah.
So just like Lawrence was pointing out, he doesn't perhaps make a difference, but some of these people are darker skinned. They look like Indians, and then if they're going to the consulate, they are being watched. So there's a fear on the other side as well. So it's a very complicated existence for them. And so I think here Srimati has a question. There's a microphone here. Collage.
I am Srimati Chakraborty from Delhi University and Division of Chinese Studies. I found this concept of minuscule minority very interesting. I was wondering if other scholars or writers have used something similar. If not, I think it gives birth to a new genre in social sciences. We all know about minorities. Minorities matter politically because they're vote banks or whatever. But minuscule minorities don't. But still, sociologically, they are very important. So I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on it if possible. Thank you.
So I took the concept of minuscule minority not so much from a theoretical source as much as I said from a legal one. But from the academic perspective, I mean, the one person who I believe has kind of invoked, if not the idea of the minuscule minority, the idea of small numbers is Arjun Apadare. Arjun, in his book, The Fear of Small Numbers, I mean, precisely looks at this question, why is it that there is a kind of a spectral fear that very small numbers evoke, and what is the power of small numbers? But of course, when Arjun is looking at small, he's still looking at the not so small in the way that we're looking at the microscopic minorities. So, is there a conceptual possibility that we could work with it? I believe there is, and for me, it really is the question of assuming that one were to ask of any nation a set of ethical and political questions about how one measures and tests, policies and the kind of ethical humaneness of the nation, not from the perspective of how it treats its politically viable minorities, but how it treats its politically unviable minorities. Really in the sense of, following from, let's say, someone like Judith Butler, who argues that post 9/11 the question was not of all lives, but of what lives matter. Then large number of lives don't matter. So in that sense, I mean, it raises the bar of what one can actually demand, of the language of politics. And I feel like that is the productive aspect of why it might, work to insert the idea of the minuscule at the heart of political obligation and not, something which is larger. So.
Yeah.
I wanted to add to the question that you posed actually about visas and So I wanted to add to a few questions that you posed to Lawrence about the naturalization of the Chinese citizens. So the most, again, I'm from Kolkata, so don't have much data about Delhi yet. So data is from Kolkata. And most of the people who have this issue of citizenship and statelessness was brought up about a year back in some newspaper reports too. And they're all most in the 60s, and some of them are born before 47, some of them are born after 47. And the beauty is, we don't recognize, I think that's the legal aspect, anybody born before 1950, when India became a republic, as a naturalized citizen of India. So if you were born in 1949 in India, in Kolkata, you have the birth certificate of Eden Hospital, Kolkata, you'll still not be a citizen by naturalization, by birth, because India was not formed then too. So a lot of these people have approached me for help, and what I have I may pose this question to the broader audience to get some suggestions maybe about how to go about this. So what has happened is, as all of you probably know, most of them are PRC holders, and some of them are British passport holders, some of them are British subject holders, some of them are Taiwan passport holders. They have never been to UK, and some of them have never been to China too. And every year they have to pay. This year they had to pay almost 10,000 rupees, and always be mistreated in the FRO office. Because China ka hai, oh, bad now. That kind of thing. They have all of them have reported that kind of mistreatment from the very beginning. And so the way I figured through my own research is that what we could do is go the OCI way for them, so that they don't need to do this yearly ritual of having a visa done. So I don't know if anybody is aware of this OCI issue. OCI is the Overseas Citizen of India. And if I am a PRC holder and the Indian government thinks that I am a foreigner, then I am an overseas citizen. But I am not overseas actually. I have been living in India all my life. So how do I qualify myself as an OCI? And for that I have a lot of RTI conversation with the Ministry of Home Affairs. And the feedback I have got from the officers to be is that you got to prove that you have applied for the citizenship before you can claim to be an OCI. So some of the qualities required of a person to claim to be an OCI is that this guy needs to have some father born in India or yourself born in India, and there's a few more qualities, and they qualify for almost all of them. But they will not give the OCI to you because you cannot prove that you ever wanted to be a citizen of India. There is an issue over there also. I think I'm taking a little bit more time.
I think we can talk more about it after you finish your talk also. So we'll have some time for Q&A,
all right.
And people can think about it.
I just have a very quick answer. I think the OCI regulations also give the date of 1949. That's
47, 49 for the Republic. You have a question here? Yeah.
It's not a question, it's rather a comment to Lawrence. So your use of linguistic minorities can also come up when it talks about the diversity of a nation, where the smallest of the smallest communities are brought up as the examples of a nation as a coherent territorial boundary where you have various different sort of people and culture coming together. Like you have the Parsis in Bombay, and they did very well in the colonial period, whereas the Chinese also did very well. But the history in the post-colonial period is very different. Ms. Banerjee, I just recently finished my fieldwork in Chinatown in Calcutta. So right now it seems like a lot of the people are moving out of Tangra, searching for places outside. Not just for business, but also because the rent is becoming too high, and there are huge amount of new constructions coming up in the area. They can't live along with the people they used to live before. So how will home become for these people now? Is it still relevant in such a way that they need to cohere together as a Chinatown?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it's tied up really with wider urban politics, but also initiatives that the government is taking. One of Tangra's decline was because the Teneris were asked to move out, and in the past 3-4 years, the real estate has really taken over. So you see there are property developers who have bought over tanneries sold by Chinese who have either emigrated, or who have moved to other parts of the city. Because of the way Calcutta has grown, You see, the Tangra Chinatown, when I started my research in 2005, there was a lot of talk at the government level about the need to turn Tangra into a touristy Chinatown, much more than the central Calcutta Chinatown. And my feelings at that point was that the central Calcutta Chinatown really embodies that cosmopolitanness of the city. So why that and why not that and why Tangra? And it seemed to me at that time that, situated between a five-star hotel, ITC Sonarbanga, and the way the real estate developed, to have that block of a tannery with sewers, so on, was not great. So the idea of a touristy Chinatown seemed more attractive to the government at that time. But that has changed, and I think the way the community also views it has changed. There are, of course, market forces that the community can't fight unless there are initiatives that are taken to preserve these spaces. So yes, a lot of these spaces remain in memory, like the poem that I got from one of the websites. It would be interesting to see whether the community belongs to the city as a whole. In my own research, I argued for the case of thinking about the neighborhood as a place of belonging for the community. But evidently now is the time when the community is moving out. There are a lot more people intermarrying with other communities. So yeah, it's a transition point.
On the question of diversity, I just wanted to add something, which is that even within the mantra of unity, diversity, etc., what is interesting, of course, is something which we rarely speak about, but that I think needs to be talked about, and that's the question of race. Because if you look at the distinction, for example, of common everyday epithets of abuse, you'd have the saying that, oh, of course in India we make fun of everyone, we have Bihari jokes, we have Punjabi jokes, etc. Yeah, but these are very often framed within the logic of the nation. Whereas anyone from the northeast would be called a Japanese or a Chinese or a Chinky, immediately creating the sense of the otherness in terms of, in a national sense. And I think that, again, we haven't spoken about it today, but maybe at some point in time, this question of the racial experience and the specifically racial experience of the Chinese community needs to be spoken about.
Any last questions? No? Yes? Last question. Can you take the microphone?
Rita, what is your finding that during the war, 62, what was the Chinese government policy toward the Indian who were settling down their life, the Chinese who were here, highlighted something? Could you?
Yeah, maybe I can tell you that. So the Chinese, many of these things are in the notes exchanged between the PRC government and the Republic of India government. So they show up and the Chinese government claims that all the Chinese are their nationals. The issue was when the Indian government deported these people, many of them were going for the first time to China, many of them were born here. So they were placed in various farming villages. You saw the pictures of them. So 62 was not a good time in China either. And so they were also mistreated. The stories that they tell us, that they were all washed with a hose so that they are not carrying any diseases from India. And they were all mistreated as well when they were put into these communities, basically ghettos in these areas. And many of them still continue to face discrimination because they don't look like Chinese, Han Chinese. So their experience going back in the 60s and some of them today is quite bad as well. But among the returnees, there are, I think Severin will talk about it in more detail, there are different groups. The Chinese who had just moved to Kolkata and gone back, they were very happy to be back. Those people who were from Assam and other places and perhaps other sites beyond Kolkata, they were the ones much conflicted about their new home, which I think many of them have not adjusted to still. And this is the reason why, as Rita was pointing, they are longing for their home in India, with different places. So they suffered when they went back to India, went back to China, or went to China. Indian communities in China was also, there were a number of people who were forced to leave China. There is a case I talk about, one Indian guy in Shanghai who was accused of raping a Chinese woman and put into jail for 5 years. Many other Indians living in China also left, but they were not treated as the Chinese in India. They were not interned as such. So the treatment was similar in some ways, but very different from what the Chinese experienced. If the Chinese here are minuscule, the Indians in China were minuscule. Very few that were there when this war happened. They had already left in 49, many of them. Shall we then thank the three presenters? The first thing